I'm Dana Perino, and this is Perino on Politics. Well, we were off to the horse races this past weekend. Now we're talking about presidential horse races. Welcome to Perino on Politics, where we give you everything you need to know from a 30,000-foot view of this week in politics. Joining me back on the podcast is my friend, Senior Vice President of CRC Advisors, Matt Whitlock. Matt, welcome back.
Good to be with you again. What an
Crowd
honor.
favorite.
I don't believe that, but good to chat with you as always.
So for the last 3 weeks, I took a little detour because the campaign was a little bit slow, which we're going to talk about. And I wanted to focus on some of the issues. So on tax day, we talked about the economy with Brian Brenberg of Fox Business. And on Earth Day, we did energy and environment policy issues and the politics of it with Daniel Turner. And then last week, we did foreign policy with Michael Allen. So all of that was amazing. But now we are just back to raw politics, which is what everybody really wants, I think.
Well, I think those obviously feed into it. But now it's nice to take all those policy pieces together in sort of the holistic view of where this horse race is.
Way to spin it for me. Absolutely. He has a way with words, folks. So, Matt, you follow all of these things. I think that people would be looking for an update on where you think Trump and Biden are at this point. I mean, Trump's hanging in there with a little bit of a lead.
I think Trump is hanging in there with a lead. And I think the last, I would say, three big economic reports, the inflation report, the economic activity report that showed that growth was slowing, and then the jobs report that was just about a week and a half ago, suggests that we're going to be at least seeing a few more weeks of Trump in the lead polling. Because when the economy is looking bad or slowing down, I think everyone becomes an economy first voter. And I think, ABC had a poll yesterday that showed still Trump has a huge advantage on the economy and on the border, which are the two biggest issues voters care about. And so even though Trump is spending a lot of his day in hearing rooms, he's still really, I think, outperforming what people are expecting, because Biden is underperforming on every issue. And Biden himself is not really in a position to push back or to hold press conferences where he can make combative statements or go on the road and really make his case for why his plans are better than Trump's. And so people are left with looking at the current economic indicators and seeing Biden has spent close to $10 trillion of our tax money, and all it's getting us is higher prices, higher gas prices, and fewer jobs.
So let's talk a little bit about the battleground states, right? Mm-hmm. So on this podcast, people have learned that, yes, once again, this election is going to come down to a handful of states and really just maybe tens of thousands of votes.
Yeah.
And if that. And then I was reading this morning in one of the newsletters I read that there is talk, especially amongst pro-Trump campaign folks, maybe not directly from the campaign, but that they think they can expand the handful of gettable states to include states like Virginia and Minnesota. And I was thinking, seriously, on paper, I look at it and I think that's possible. In my gut, I think, yeah, it's possible. And then I remember how I felt in cycles past, when I thought that as well, even in the midterm, some of the midterm elections. And the Democrats have outperformed in the last three cycles, maybe presidential, midterm. And I have to ask for a reality check, or is it possible that this map expands?
Well, and that's something that the Trump team has been trying to sort of telegraph with their outward-facing messaging and some of their presentations to donors that have made their way into places like the New York Times. They've got a very bullish map, like you're describing, where they go after states like Minnesota and Virginia. And then they've got more realistic maps that are focused on, what they have called the media's version of these maps, which are your traditional Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, which I think most people still see as the entire battle. And so personally, I think it's going to come down to the states that we already know are the battle. I think every election cycle, when there's a week or two of really positive momentum, campaigns start to talk about where are we going to expand. For Republicans, A lot of times it's expanding into Virginia. I mean, not that long ago, Wisconsin was a reach state, and then that's changed into a state that is pretty reliably purple. And so we have these shifts, but I think it's going to come down to those ones that we expect: Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. They are all states that are trending Trump's way right now at the very worst of Biden's sort of lag and this major sort of enthusiasm problem he's seeing, particularly with core voters. Big bunch of news stories over the weekend about how particularly Black and Hispanic voters, their enthusiasm, where normally he can count on about 80% of the Black vote. Right now, it looks like it's in the 60s. That impacts these states specifically: Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan. And so I do think that as that wanes, they're going to talk about expanding, reaching a little bit further. But at the end of the day, I think it's going to come down to those core states that, we can talk about being done deals right now when it looks good, but it's early. We're in the beginning of May. If it still looks this way in August or after Labor Day, maybe you can, start to sort of talk more aggressively that way. But I just think we've got a lot of time left, and it's really easy to get cocky. But I think right now you got to focus on your fundamentals.
Then I'm going to cross off my list expanding the map. We're thinking about expanding the map right now and wait until Labor Day.
That's what I would do.
Because a question for you, though, like if the Trump team were to try to expand the map to get more battleground states or more states into the battleground territory, do they have to spend a lot of money there, or is the news cycle and people's lived experience really the campaign contribution that the Trump team needs to go against Biden?
That is what they're leaning on right now when they talk about expanding the map. The fact that inflation is hitting certain states differently, the fact that, people in Minnesota are particularly frustrated. They're definitely looking at the Minnesota Democrat primary results, where you had such a large number of people who were unhappy with Joe Biden. So those are the kind of factors that they're plugging into this math and this calculus. But I think at the end of the day, it is going to be a huge money suck. And once you get past Labor Day, when it really is an all-out blitz in your traditional swing states, it will be very hard to make an argument for diverting money from a state like Georgia or a state like North Carolina. I think will be less close than some of these. But I think Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, they all have pretty expensive money markets. They all also have, pretty expensive Senate races. Those three in particular, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, have Republican candidates who have a lot of money and a pretty good argument to make. They're not in some people's top tiers for gettable Senate races, but I think that will impact how the presidential sees the map themselves. They don't have to spend as much money in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin because they're paired up with Senate races with, in some cases, self-funders who have a lot of money to put into it to make it really competitive.
I didn't even bother starting off this conversation with talking about the marathon that Trump is trying to run with 20-pound weights on his ankles that Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor in New York, has attached to the campaign. President Trump is only really able to campaign on Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, Friday night maybe, because he's in court every day, and that could go on for another 3 to 4 weeks. I think the reason I didn't start off with it is that there is just no evidence at all, one, that there's a crime.
Sure.
We haven't seen that. We're covering this pretty closely here. Two, there's no evidence that it's hurting Trump.
That's the thing. I think his team is really effectively taking those sound bites from before he goes into the courtroom. And those are pretty, kind of winding little press appearances that he does where he touches on a lot of different things. But they take out the one piece that is really effectively hitting Joe Biden. For example, this morning, the one line of President Trump saying, look, the people that are funding those campus protests that everyone's really mad about are also funding Joe Biden's campaign. Getting those little lines in there when he has every camera in the country turned to him, I think has helped him. And to contrast, Joe Biden is not really out hitting the campaign trail hard. His team can put out some really, barn burning tweets about it, but it's just not matching. And so I think, to your point, it's not having the impact that I think a lot of Democrats thought it would. And I also think a lot of it's hard to do this sort of naked political move like this Trump legal fight when there are such big other issues going on that I think, a lot of people look at Trump in court and say it's dumb that he has to be there when we have all these major international crises going on. It makes it all look smaller and kind of petty.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Biden and the campaign over the weekend, just on Sunday. So we're recording this on Monday, May 6th. Over the weekend, on Cinco de Mayo, Biden's campaign said You know what? We just have our guys out there way too much, and we're going to cut back on his media appearances. We're going to cut back on his speeches. They're going to be shorter in length. We want more quality over quantity. And I almost fell over. I'm like, what do you mean quantity?
Well, and that's the thing. When your campaign, your top level campaign team is out telling media that we will perform better if people are seeing less of our candidate, I think things are in a pretty bad place. And I do think that they're seeing this massive vulnerability of every time President Biden gets out there, he's either saying a statement that then everyone in the media has to now kind of start to correct. They're not ignoring those anymore, or kind of wandering off stage, or tying himself to some historic event that was 100 years before he was born. Just a lot of things that are getting him in more trouble. And so what they're acknowledging is his public appearances are doing more harm than good, which goes back to their biggest fundamental problem. The principal, the candidate in this case, cannot steer the ship in a way to fix it. And that, I think, is going to be a challenge that, they have all the money in the world, but if you don't have a candidate, that's pretty tough to fight to a draw.
It's really bizarre. I mean, you said something to me that I think I can repeat here, or I'll just use it as my own thing, which is, President Trump is using these moments that he has before and after court to hold court, his own media court. But because he doesn't just relentlessly focus on Biden, pretty much the sound bites that get taken are about how he believes that the trial's unfair, that the gag order is unfair, and there's a lot of people agree with all of that. But if he were hammering Biden more, would he be up higher in the polls?
I think if what he's gotten out of those sound bites against Biden is any indication, if he spent more time focusing on Biden and on the issues at hand and less time talking about the unfairness of his trial, and I understand he's never not going to talk a little bit about it, but I think he's having a major impact when he uses those moments for, I think it throws it in the face of the Biden team that he can use those for his campaigning. They're trying to get him off the campaign trail. If on his way in, he's able to make a few points about the state of the race, or like he did a couple weeks ago, where he's visited with union members to make the news cycle about union members being sick of Joe Biden and supporting Trump, I think that's really been to his advantage. And so I think the more he talks, and I think, if you look at his Truth Social feed, you'll see much more of it is about the unfairness of his trial than, the campaign. And there's certainly an audience for, outrage about the trial. I think, as you guys have talked about, a lot of people, there's not a really good case for why this trial is even happening. And so, of course, the president's going to tee off on that. But I think the more energy and resources he can dedicate in the limited time he has to Biden, it will pay off in dividends because of how strong the disapproval for Biden is right now on just about every issue.
My last section of this segment, I want to talk about RFK Jr.
Yes.
Because I think about 3 or 4 weeks ago, people had written him off, right? He chose a vice president that no one had ever heard of. Yes, she has a lot of money. Maybe she's a fantastic candidate person. He said she is the most qualified person in America to be the vice president. I found that to be absurd, frankly. And I am intrigued by his candidacy. I am watching his moves. I thought it was extremely clever how he figured out how to get on that Michigan ballot. He might get on the California ballot. He's looking at some of these states going, he's picking smart battles. He's got an eccentric team. The Biden team has a full-time dedicated communications staffer to try to destroy RFK Jr. There are polls that have come out that said he actually might hurt Trump as well. Trump recently said that RFK Jr. is not a serious candidate. Democrats say RFK Jr. is a right-wing crank. Republicans say RFK Jr. is a left-wing plant. Should we be paying more attention to what's happening with RFK Jr.?
I think we are probably paying a pretty appropriate amount of attention to RFK Jr., but I do think that is changing. I think there's more that he's doing that's worth keeping an eye on. I think in the beginning, both sides saw him as sort of an opportunity to troll the other side. And then they both now have seen polling that there are different ways it hurts their own candidate. And so you had, a lot of people who support President Trump saying he should consider RFK as a running mate. A lot of people saying they liked things he said. You had people on the left saying, wouldn't it be great for RFK to run so he can cut into Trump support, particularly among vaccine skeptics, things like that. So I think he's definitely a fascinating figure to watch. I think the Biden team trying to counteract him has been interesting. When they rolled out the ad with all the other Kennedy family members talking about how they support Joe Biden, I thought this is interesting. For one, it shows the Biden team is nervous about RFK and his impact. Two, it suggests that they think people actually care, that they are supporting RFK because he's a Kennedy and not because, he's got interesting things to say. If you roll back 2+ years, RFK was treated as a pretty unserious person, in large part because he had talked about a lot of conspiracy theories. A lot of people viewed him as kind of an anti-vaxxer crank. And for Republicans, he said a lot of crazy things about how climate deniers should be punished and things like that. And now to have him be this figure, I think is a very just interesting indication of where we are right now in politics. The level of dissatisfaction people have with Biden and Trump. I don't know that there's a lot of people who, there is a certain segment that are diehard, I love RFK. I think more than anything, you're seeing that there are just people who want an alternative to Trump and Biden. And that's where a lot of that's coming in. And I understand that. We are seeing polling showing that this is the lowest enthusiasm election that we've ever seen, just because neither side is as thrilled about their candidates as they have been at times in the past. And so that, I think, creates an opening for someone like an RFK. The question will be, can he continue to capitalize on it? There's been a lot of stories in the last few days about losing staff members, losing strategists, people, kind of returning home to their parties worried about actually supplanting the election, things like that. We'll see how that actually goes, because I think if he stays the course and actually pulls some more clever moves like getting on these ballots, I think he'll definitely be a factor worth watching.
I hope I get a chance to interview Nicole Shanahan. I've made a request, but you always get the same answer from the Kennedy team. It's weird.
Yeah, I'm sure.
They're like, oh, thank you very much, but we're really busy.
We will be putting our words out on X.
Exactly. Matt, we'll be right back. And we're back with Perino on Politics, and Matt Whitlock is my guest. Matt, I want to talk about the House and Senate races, and maybe even a governor's race or two if you want to bring them up. How are things looking right now for Republicans trying to take back the Senate and Democrats trying to take back the House?
So as we've talked about, I think the Senate map is already looking advantageous to Republicans because of Joe Manchin. You'll remember Joe Manchin voted for the Inflation Reduction Act and then saw his polls flip about 40% and almost immediately announced that he would be retiring, which put the map going into next cycle at 50-50. So that sets up what Republicans need to do, which is gain, and Republicans would love to gain 4 or 5 seats, because one of the biggest factors on my mind right now is the fact that Republicans will not have a map this favorable for about a decade. We have a number of red states with Democrat senators who have just found ways to narrowly escape losing in past cycles. I'd say Mitch McConnell did an interview about this last week, and he talked about how a lot of people are looking at a giant Senate map. His primary focuses right now are Montana and Ohio. Even though those are very, very red states, John Tester in Montana and Sherrod Brown in Ohio have been difficult to beat before. But I think particularly for Tester, I don't know how he pulls this one out, because he's sharing a ballot with President Trump, and he would need to win probably about 20% of Republican votes or more to pull that out. And I just don't see that coming, especially when he's voted more than 90% of the time with Joe Biden. He's found ways to get the media to talk about him as a moderate, but he's not really a moderate in any way. And that's the same issue for people like Bob Casey in Pennsylvania. If I were to rate the Senate races that I think are the most attainable, I would say obviously West Virginia is already pretty much a done deal. Then I'd put Montana, then I'd put Ohio. But after that, I would put Pennsylvania, because I think that we've seen Bob Casey as somebody else who has tried to be a moderate. And when he ran, first time 20 plus years ago, he did pitch himself as a moderate. He was one of those rare pro-life Democrats. And that doesn't exist anymore. And now he votes about 98% of the time with his party and with Joe Biden. And when a lot of these people are facing good, formidable, well-organized, well-funded Republican candidates like Dave McCormick in Pennsylvania, you see Bob Casey is really starting to sweat it. And I think he's hit a ceiling in the low to mid 40s that gives Dave McCormick a much better opportunity. And Tim Sheehy in Montana, also well-resourced, well-supported. He does not have a tough primary race that might have made it more difficult. So I think that there are a number of seats where Republicans look to gain and carve into that. Bernie Moreno in Ohio is another one that I think has a real opportunity because of how much redder Ohio has become since Sherrod Brown last defended that seat in 2018. And then you have a number of states like we talked about before, Michigan, Wisconsin, that have good Republican candidates who are well resourced, but in bigger sort of reach states for Republicans. So if President Trump were to have an expand the map kind of night on election night in November, we would also be looking at some of those seats like, Michigan, Wisconsin, et cetera.
That would be something.
We have good candidates there, but I think I go back to what Mitch McConnell said. Our biggest goal is simply to win the majority, and the key to doing that will likely begin with Montana and Ohio. But I think after that, there's a lot of places where there are opportunity. It just depends on how the tides, rise and fall. So that'll be
Nevada and Arizona, you put in that category?
I really like our candidate in Nevada, Sam Brown. He's a very, very sharp guy. I met him just last week, and I think that one will continue to rise into the tier of being competitive. I don't think it's quite at the level of Pennsylvania right now in my sort of top four. Arizona's a bigger reach. I think Arizona is going to be a challenge. I think, the abortion decision there, I think Kari Lake and President Trump are trying to navigate that in a unique way. And we'll see how that one plays out. But right now, I would say Arizona feels to me like a bigger reach than some of those others, which is interesting because I think President Trump is seeing Arizona as sort of baked in on his map. And so, Ruben Gallego, I would be very surprised to not see him start to soften his way he talks about President Trump, because he'll be looking at probably trying to take 2, 3, 4% of, Trump's voters if Trump is looking as good as he is right now after Labor Day in Arizona. So I think that's a very interesting state to watch dynamics wise.
So I just want to ask you about one more. Colin Reed, who's a friend of ours and a friend of this podcast, he always says that Democrats think of Texas, it's their fool's gold.
Yeah.
They're always like, we're definitely we're going to be a factor in Texas. Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas, has a challenger, Colin Allred, who's a Democrat, very popular Democrat in Texas. And Cruz's lead is not what he would like it to be.
Definitely. And this is similar to what...
But is it still fool's gold for Democrats?
I think it is still fool's gold. This reminds me a little bit in 2020 when John Cornyn in Texas was running against a woman named MJ Hager, and she had just so much money. But at the end of the day, it wasn't close. I think that Democrats are making inroads in Texas, but I think that Republicans... I think Governor Abbott has done a pretty good job helping build a strong conservative movement in Texas. And I think Ted Cruz is raising the money he needs to be really competitive. I would not put that one as even close to the danger zone, but I know, Senator Cruz is treating it like it is. But the one I would say is a wild card to watch is Maryland with Governor Hogan, where at the very least he'll get Democrats to spend money. But also the Democrat primary is a very interesting one to watch.
It's getting vicious, isn't it?
It's vicious. Well, you've got David Trone, who's a current House member, who's spent already like $35 million.
Of his own money?
Of his own money. He runs, is it Total Wine?
Who wants to be in the Senate that badly?
Well, that's the thing. I think, for him, it's kind of easy because his commute is like, across a bridge, and then he's at work and he gets to be a senator. But he already is like I think probably a billionaire. But the woman running against him, her name is Angela Alsobrooks, and she just rolled out this ad that they're calling like a Maryland Avengers ad, which has every elected official from, the federal level in Maryland coming out and endorsing her against David Trone. And so it'll be kind of down to the wire. Their primary is next Tuesday. I think that'll just be really, really interesting to see what comes out of it, because Larry Hogan, is the kind of candidate you want in a blue state. And if he can spread the map too, that's very exciting. I know McConnell's talked very highly about that race being one to watch, particularly if this primary shakes out into the weird bloodbath it looks like on the other side.
So when I worked on Capitol Hill, I was a House rat.
Yes.
You were a Senate rat, though we didn't work there at the same time because I'm a little bit older than you. But I know you don't pay as much attention to the House. Just do you think that the Republicans can keep the majority, or is that in jeopardy?
I think they can keep the majority. I would say, though, that the chances of winning the Senate are probably a tiny bit higher than keeping the House, just because of how the map looks and where we have particularly challenging House races. But I think keeping the majority and even potentially expanding it slightly is very much on the table. Again, depending just in part on how some of these dynamics on election night go. If Trump were to have a very good election night, I think there's a lot of House races that look very, very good for us. And I think there's a lot of places where the NRCC team has done a really good job. Honestly, I think Speaker Johnson has done a really good job of raising money and getting out there, helping candidates where he can, trying to give them some things they can take home and run on, but also a lot of areas where they can really highlight how the Biden administration is making lives worse for people with the help of House Democrats.
Love it. Okay, Matt, sit right there. We'll be right back with more Perino on Politics next. And welcome back to Perino on Politics. Matt, I want to ask you in the last few minutes that we have, what am I missing? What are you paying attention to that I might not have on my radar?
Let me point to two big stories that have come out in the last 3 days. First, Politico had a story over the weekend about the tweet that went with it was pro-Palestinian protesters are backed by a surprising source, Biden's biggest donors. That was very, very interesting because it covered something that we've been talking about quite a bit, which is the protests on college campuses are not some organic movement of true believers. They're all backed very heavily by the same group of left-wing dark money groups, whether it be the Rockefeller brothers, George Soros, the Hewlett Foundation, other groups like that have been tied into this. And so Politico writing that was a very big deal. And it got a lot of pushback from the left, but it presented data that's pretty hard for anyone to argue against.
Yeah.
These groups have funded Students for Justice in Palestine who are funding these protests. When people say all their tents are matching, all their talking points are similar, they've got professional signs. Where's
Not to mention the plywood that they've all bought at Home Depot
to build their little fortresses, which I think is very interesting. The second story that I would flag ties to that, and it's from Carol Markowitz just this morning, about essentially a left-wing activism pipeline that these same dark money groups have built, starting from when kids are very young. There's a group called Our Children's Trust that's using kids as young as 8 years old to be the faces of these climate lawsuits, where in states like Montana, you've got a group of kids that are suing, saying, we have a right to a healthy climate. That is all also funded by these same groups who are funding climate protests on campuses. Groups like the Rockefeller brothers, they are getting 8-year-old kids to come out and be the faces of these lawsuits, indoctrinating them into this. So you've got a pipeline from childhood through college where they become radical activists, in some of these protests, all the way through their careers where they're getting trained to be activists. And I thought it was really interesting. Peggy Noonan, when she went to Columbia, tried to talk to a group of these protesters, and they said they either ignored her completely, or one girl said to her, I'm not trained, so I can't talk to you. There's training going on, and it's coming from a lot of these same left-wing dark money groups. So it's very interesting to sort of track how that works. And again, it's not just these anti-Israel protests, it's climate litigation, every issue that you're seeing. And a lot
trans
of
issues.
Yeah, exactly. Every major political flashpoint you're seeing, the left-wing dark money enterprise is plugged in and supporting it. And that, I think, is just important to identify, because some people are tempted to look at these and think, look at these kids who are just motivated by doing good. I mean, in a lot of cases, they're run by professional agitators and protesters who are training kids to be radicals. And I think it's just important for people to be aware of.
Indeed. And also Barack Obama went to Columbia.
Where's he?
He said nothing.
Where is he? I am so fascinated by how Barack Obama picks pitches on what he weighs in on and what he chooses to kind of skip.
He's like, I'm going to let Biden twist in the wind on this one.
Which he is doing. I mean, the Biden team is really struggling with this. At the very least, they've upgraded who's giving statements from Andrew Bates, deputy press secretary, and you're starting to have at least Biden come out and kind of, this is not good. Also, Islamophobia is bad. At least it's elevated to him.
I laugh because I was a deputy press secretary, one of my favorite jobs of my life, but I never confused myself with the commander in chief.
No. Well, and
also the other thing that's weird is that you can issue a paper statement and you can ask the president, can I put your name on this? So why aren't they doing that? Why weren't they doing that? Anyway,
that's a tell.
Water under the bridge.
But I think that's a tell. I think that's an important thing to look at and say, why did the president not want to have a statement about these protests until now? And I think we know why. Look at that Senate map. Look at that presidential map in the state of Michigan. That's why you're getting Andrew Bates instead of President Joe Biden defending these Jewish students on campus who are, being treated like it's the 1940s.
Amazing. Matt, I got to run, so I'm going to go do the 5, but I have a question for you. This is the quiz part. It's multiple choice. Which president attended the Kentucky Derby more than any other president, going a total of 13 times? Was it Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, or Ronald Reagan?
Oh, geez, that's really hard.
I had no idea.
Oh, man. I would, what was the first one you said? Gerald Ford?
Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, or Ronald Reagan. I will say it's somebody from a current battleground state.
So probably not Reagan.
Yeah.
Gee, I would guess Gerald Ford.
Yeah, you're right. It's Gerald Ford. He witnessed two horses that eventually became Triple Crown winners, Seattle Slew in 1977 and Affirmed in 1978. However, Genuine Risk was said to be his favorite Derby winner.
Wow.
And now you know.
Love that. If only we had elected Mitch McConnell president, he could dominate that answer in trivia.
On that question.
There, 40
you can
times?
go pass on this new knowledge to Little Weston and Jesse Wayne.
I will.
And thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.